He was an entitled, narcissistic jerk who believed that the world owed him not just a living for doing what he was doing, but to be in charge of the whole frickin' planet.
So recently, James Lindsay was on the Dad Saves America podcast talking about the truth regarding Karl Marx, his life, and how his ideas went on to inspire academia and political phenomenon we're still feeling today. You know, I've very much disagreed with the musings of Lindsay when it comes to issues like Israel, but let's see if we have some crossover here. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Yeah, I think that all you have to have is something kind of like that combined. I don't think it's being persuaded by the argument. I think it's actually the emotional resonance precedes believing the argument, which is often resentment or envy. You know, there are some data showing that, you know, downwardly mobile elites are the ones who are most likely. So you have Mandami, who's, you know, the son of these very successful people, who is not going to be as successful, you know, he's not as talented as his parents. I mean, whether they're good or evil doesn't matter. And so what's he got to do? Well, this is his ride. But there's also a certain, there has to be a certain narcissism there as well. And I think it has to be a certain type of narcissism. The grandiose narcissism is not as likely, I think, to stick here. But the wounded or vulnerable narcissist who is in that kind of position, you know, Marx definitely overestimated the value of what he was doing. He thought that he should basically be literally leader of the freaking world. If the Communist Party took over through worldwide revolutions and he's at the top of the party, he thought he should be leader of the world because he had all these brilliant ideas that nobody would pay attention to because they were actually crap. To the point where his mother actually wrote him a letter after Marx begged her for money again, saying, Marx, you know, Karl, you write a lot about capital and it would be nice if you earned some. But the reason that it's not that he wasn't, I mean, he's a prolific writer. It's actually frustrating how much the man wrote if you try to read his, you know, his works. There's just, every time I'm like, okay, I need to suck it up and read this other thing. And I go get the PDF or whatever, I find it and I'm like, 370 pages. And I'm like, my God, could you write something that's like 15 just once? You know, it's like.
Yeah, it's interesting he says that in regard to Marx's close friends and confidants, including Friedrich Engels, the co-founder of Marxism. You know, there were times when Engels had, you know, essentially bankrolled Marx through much of his career, and at times he would push back about the funding Marx seemed to need along the same lines, and you can see parallels between Mamdani and Engels, because Engels was the son of a wealthy factory owner, a textile factory owner that bankrolled Marx for much of that time. And, you know, Marx was putting out output that wasn't well received during his time. It wasn't well received. In fact, Marx didn't really become a name, even in kind of niche, kind of dissident movements, until really the Bolsheviks took power, because the Bolsheviks were inspired by it. So, you know, Marx had become an obscure figure for many decades before that time, and his output did not achieve the success that it later would. Ultimately, it has had such an influence on our society. But yeah.
Everything's a book. He wrote so much, it's insane. It's like his notebooks on the side of Capital, which is called the Grundrisse, is like 900 pages of just like notes turned into a book, sorta. It's like, oh my God, stop. So it's clear that the man had capability to do something, and he had talent. He, you know, obviously had a command of the dialectics. He had a command of the philosophy to a degree. He apparently could rabble-rouse some people to a degree, but he couldn't produce value for other people is the problem. So you have to have that entitled, wounded narcissism in combination with that. He's not the artist or the thinker or the writer who's in love with his project. I mean, clearly he was, but making it because he loves it, you know, come hell or high water.
Yeah, he was extremely talented on living off the backs of others, especially Engels and especially his mother, at times various other people closely connected to him, where he didn't really produce much of value that people wanted in his day. Now, of course, now he's one of the most consumed authors in history in the English language. He's, I dare say, one of the most influential figures in the entire history of the world now. But it wasn't the case at the time, where he was, you know, struggling because he wouldn't work to do things to provide value. at the time. Again, he was funded by other people, and you can see the hypocrisy in this, and the fact that the workers of the world were supposed to unite around these ideas, and he wasn't exactly a worker in that way. He was just given what he had from other people. That was voluntary, that was up to them. But that is the truth regarding Marx and his background. He also knocked up the housekeeper and essentially, I think, had 2 children with her, maybe 1, I can't exactly remember, and then, took no active role in wanting to, help support them and love them and raise them.
Come pay or no pay, or finding a path to, get patronage so that he can actually do it, in an esteemed way. Nope. He was an entitled, narcissistic jerk who believed that the world owed him not just a living for doing what he was doing, but to be in charge of the whole frickin' planet. So you've got to have that other ingredient. And I think that ingredient is actually almost crucial. But the thing is I think that can be inculcated by people who get kind of pulled in. But the vector that pulls people in a lot of cases is that creative type you described, and your work should be more valued than it is. You do great drawings and you can't even sell them for $5 a piece because people don't want drawings. And so, of cartoon characters or whatever it is you draw. So you should be more valued than you are. And you start to inculcate that wounded narcissistic entitlement into people. Then the theory becomes like the feed that attaches to that to run the cycle deeper. I think that that's kind of the mechanism, but it all starts with thinking that probably most cases, this intellectual work that you're talking about should be more valued than it is, and you should be more valued than you are. And that, I think, is the emotional hook.
Yeah, I really agree with this, actually. This is at the root of a lot of people that are, creative types, creating output, content creators, artists, musicians, etc. is, music and visual arts can be as aesthetically pleasing as the imagination can take you. But the problem is, no matter how great they might look to someone's subjective mentalities, if you can't find an audience for it, if you can't find a market for it, it doesn't help others. It doesn't really provide value to the extent that you might internalize and you might think your product is worthy of. And that is at the root of a lot of Marxism, a lot of the narratives that have been pushed from the economic realm in, the oppressor versus oppressed categories into the cultural realm, when you have, the race war, sex war, war on women, all these different varieties and flavors of Marxism and Marxist influence coming into society, is that, if there's not a market for it, it doesn't deserve value of people's voluntary trade to accumulate it. And some of those things are just there to kind of divide and conquer the populace, while I think the elites that are actually in control of the politics and the levers that they pull can, complete their agenda regardless, because and much easier because people are fighting with each other on these grounds, on these cultural lines, on these economic lines, etc. That's what we've seen, I think, especially in the last century.
And then you just off to the races. Plus, the other side of it is, let's just be real. These ideologies, all of the Marxist species, because they're all about fomenting grievance from bottom up, create the opportunity for grifters that is unparalleled by virtually anything else. Anybody that can fit in any way whatsoever as a champion of the victim class has a pathway to success that they don't deserve anywhere, because they're producing no actual value for anybody, anywhere at all that mentality takes hold. So if you create, an oppressor versus oppressed dynamic across, any particular, I'm trying to think of a completely benign left-handedness, right-handed versus left-handed. I'm trying to think of something that, there's not some hidden coded meaning behind somewhere. Like I was going to say noses, but it's like, they're going to say something about the Jews.
There's the blue eyes, brown eyes experiment. We have the easy replicatable experiment that you can turn people against each other with a completely random identity marker today. You can get 10 kids, run the blue eyes, brown eyes experiment, and and they will turn on each other.
That's
Just
right.
give,
And then
give half of them a random armband and then say the reason why we gave it to you is because we actually knew in advance that you're the superior crowd. You get to sit in front. By the end of the day, you've fomented hate.
Right. Now, imagine you have just enough people in that crowd where somebody in the no armband crowd, right? Or somebody in that crowd has grifter mentality, right? And they realize that they can basically become the champion of the no armbands and just get resources amassed on them, not because they believe in the cause or they think anything's real about it or they actually think there's an injustice, but just by speaking to that injustice. And that you can also get somebody who does have an armband on and say, for purely grifter reasons, I'm not saying that they're moved with their emotions. I mean, we're saying in grifter sphere here, who's like, there's a huge reservoir of me being able to siphon off of the people with no armbands as long as I pretend to care about them.
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree with this. There's no doubt that people respond to incentives, and if the incentives are warped, you can still respond to those things and make money from it. That is the case, and that's the case almost everywhere. But I want to go to something he said regarding oppressed versus oppressor classes. I wouldn't say that's actually unique to Marxism, actually. Even in the classical liberal tradition that James is outspoken about and claims, there were oppressors and oppressed. The oppressors were the people in government trying to violate individual liberties, whether it was religious worship restrictions or gun ownership or the ability to get past, bureaucratic red tape. You had anti-slavery advocates pushing against oppressors that were slave owners, and you had British liberals like Charles James Fox, American abolitionists like Lysander Spooner pushing against those things. And those were oppressed and oppressor classes too, and they do manifest in other movements than Marxism. I don't see that that's innately a bad thing to bring up. It's only when that becomes the focal point to remove you from what the political agenda actually is and is being pushed. And while those cultural battles play out, it used to be economic battles under Marxism. It does still manifest that way in many countries. But while those things play out, it's the government overseers above us pushing the endless wars and the censorship regime and the surveillance state and the mass extortion machine and the welfare state. All these things go on while the people battle over those things. And, humans can multitask, but that's a phenomenon in which people dump immeasurable amounts of their energies when, the same policies play out regardless of who wins presidential races.
With my peers that do have armbands. And so the opening for the grifter space becomes humongous here. So you end up attracting psychopaths and, again, rent seekers, the kind of people that basically drive your situation into the dumpster and basically rob your circumstance or your society blind, actually become not just successful, but eventually the most successful in this architecture that's built around this wounded narcissistic dark fantasy about how the world works and should work instead to cater to their needs.
Friedrich Hayek lays out an argument, a compelling one, in his book The Road to Serfdom, why the worst get on top. And you've just basically articulated it, that in a world where you have totalitarian power at the top of the pyramid, like all the communist regimes the world has ever seen, what kind of person will win? It's the kind of person willing to slit the throats of everyone else.
That's right.
There's a book, I believe it is Love and Murder in Stalin's Russia, something like that. It's about a more idealistic socialist that was part of the inner circle at the Bolshevik Revolution named Bukharin, who many, as I understand it, look to and say, see, if he had become the leader, communism would have worked. And the part they miss, I mean, there's reasons why it doesn't work even if you've got a benevolent. You'd need someone who's God, not just benevolent, but also omnipotent and omniscient.
Yeah.
Because of the knowledge problems inherent in top-down planning of a society. You can't do it. It's literally impossible. It's not good in theory. But the politics and the psychology of it are laid so bare in this, because you see firsthand the fact that the reason why you won't get a Bukharin, true benevolent idealist leader, is because he's murdered by the guy that's willing to murder.
That's right.
That's the kind of systems that are set up in totalitarian systems where this is possible. Now, I will say there's a fine line between grifting and, just being an entrepreneur, producing ideas and art or music or whatever it is that people like. And if there's a market for that, that makes sense. If people voluntarily give their money or trade their labor for wealth, and then use the proceeds to fund ideas or environments or things that they like, I don't think that's inherently evil. It's only the bad ideas that typically are evil. And they're right, when you set up a coercive system, which is the modern state, you set up incentive structures where it is the people that slit the wrists that get up to the top. That's total totalitarianism. That's total government. That's what we've seen in many of the genocidal movements of the 20th century, spilling into this century too. So that is true. People respond to incentives, and if your incentives are virtuous, in my mind, that includes voluntaristic endeavors, trade, peace, negotiation, commerce, benevolence toward fellow man, charity, things like that. People will respond accordingly. But when you put at the top of the pedestal someone that outgames each other, outsteals, defrauds each other, slits the wrists of their political adversaries better than their opponents, that's the kind of system you get. And the truth is, many governments in that respect are mixed governments. They do, revere those things and put those things up on a pedestal to some extent, including in the United States. Not to maybe the extremes that panned out in Stalin's Soviet Union, but they do exist.
It's very simple. The guy who is willing to murder and willing to play his fellows off of each other, which is what Mao did. Mao set up in his own inner circle at all times. He had at least one power play drama going between at least two characters at any given time. And usually he had entire factions going against, because if they're at each other's throat, Mao becomes the only solution to their problem. And then whoever's more loyal is the one Mao can, bless. And then he can use that blessing on the one guy to destroy the other guy. So you got to be willing to do the murder at the end of the day. So Stalin and Mao, I don't know as much about Lenin and his organizational principles. But yeah, these guys knew how to play people off of each other, and they were perfectly willing to do the murder. And that's who's going to end up on top every single time. I think Mao probably was a true believer in communism, having read an awful lot about him. Whether that person's a true believer or not is secondary to whether or not they're ruthless.
Yeah, no question about that. And that's the history of most totalitarian communist states, for sure. I mean, there are modern totalitarian states, but even despite the evils that, they might pervade and convey and exude amongst their populaces, I still want the United States to maintain peace with them, because that's often the excuse to get into never-ending wars. We've seen that in many places like Libya and Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, and there was a push for regime change in North Korea under George W. Bush. That stuff has not worked well for the United States, but we can still recognize evil and not try to replicate that or emulate that in the United States system. James talks a lot about oppressed versus oppressor narratives, and sometimes almost in a way that they're innately something to, prohibit or push back against or really reject outright. But I actually think he sets up oppressed versus oppressor narratives in other regards where he obsesses over it and he internalizes that, including with Israel, where, he has scoffed at people for being woke right if they dare criticize Israel or USA to Israel, where his narrative regarding Israel is something of an oppressor versus oppressed narrative. That's the idea that Hamas and Hezbollah are the existential oppressors against Israel, and Israel has a right to defend itself, and Israel's, the only democracy in the Middle East. If we don't support Israel, it's a bad thing. I'm not quoting him exactly, but he said things along these lines on Twitter and other places. But really, that's the same kind of oppressed versus oppressor narrative that he seems to scoff at in other regards. Like I said, those kinds of narratives aren't unique to Marxism, but I do think they cause damage sometimes when they spill into things that distract people from what the regime actually does, what our criminal government actually does. And like I said before, it's mostly a corrupt financial system headed by the central banks that print money at will, plunge us into debt, get us into endless wars, set up surveillance states, curtail our civil liberties during COVID, make religious worship restrictions, curfews, mask mandates, vaccine mandates, what have you. So I wish that James would kind of internalize that truth and see how he actually exudes and promotes oppressor versus oppressed narratives in some regards that he, wouldn't have the same standard for others in other regards, especially when it comes to Israel. But that's what I take from this great interview. Largely agree with what these two are saying. Marx is probably the most influential person in the world, if you ask me. Like I said earlier, he's definitely among the handful of people that are, and his influence continues to be apparent even in a system where, it's impossible to ignore the catastrophic consequences of communism as it's manifested, and the amounts of bodies that have stacked up under its ruthless nature and ruthless policies. But that's what we see. That's what we look back on. I still appreciated this interview and what we can derive from it. I had the chance to meet John Papola, who hosts the Dad Saves America podcast this last weekend at Ron Paul's 90th birthday. He's a great guy. Had a good chance to meet him, and I really appreciate his podcast and bringing these ideas forward in a way that we should consider them, if not, argue against them, argue for them. So I really appreciated that. But I do want to hear from you. Let me know down below, was James Lindsay right about this? Is the oppressor versus oppressed narrative unique to Marxism? How do we see that playing out today? And is there any benefit in bringing that kind of dynamic up today? Let me know in the comments below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Dad Saves America. That is a great podcast, and I love the interviews he does on there. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can support the channel, and I'll graciously appreciate that. And in return, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.